The Wyoming wind howled like a living thing across the endless prairie, driving snow so thick that Clara Whitmore could barely see her own barn from the kitchen window. February had been merciless this year, piling drift after drift against her modest ranch house until the world outside seemed buried under an endless white shroud. Clara pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and checked the fire in the old cast-iron stove. At 22, she'd learned to read winter's moods as well as any seasoned rancher, and this storm promised to be a killer, the kind that claimed livestock, froze water barrels solid, and left families stranded for days without hope of rescue or resupply. She should have been afraid, alone as she was on the isolated homestead that her father had carved from raw wilderness 5 years before his death. But Clara had long since traded fear for stubborn determination. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when every day brought new challenges to her survival on the unforgiving frontier. The Whitmore Ranch had never been much to look at. A simple log house, a barn that leaked in 3 places, and grazing land that supported maybe 30 head of cattle in good years. But it had been her father's dream, and after consumption claimed him 2 summers ago, it had become Clara's burden and her anchor both. Her brothers, Jake and Samuel, had lasted exactly 6 months after the funeral before lighting out for California and the promise of gold in the Sierra Nevada. They'd left her with livestock to tend, debts to pay, and the impossible task of proving that a woman could hold a homestead claim without male protection. Cowards, Clara muttered, stirring the thin soup that would serve as her dinner. She'd grown used to talking to herself during the long winter months. The alternative was a silence, so complete it felt like being buried alive. Through the kitchen window, she caught a flash of movement near the property line, dark against the driving snow, moving too erratically to be wildlife. Clara pressed her face to the cold glass, squinting through the storm until she could make out the stumbling figure of a man, bent nearly double against the wind. A drifter, most likely, caught in the open when the blizzard struck. Clara had seen it before. Cowboys and travelers who underestimated winter's savagery and found themselves miles from shelter when the weather turned deadly. Most folks would ride right past such a figure, unwilling to risk their own safety for a stranger's poor planning. But Clara's father had raised her with clear principles about frontier hospitality. A person's character, he'd always said, shows truest when helping cost more than it profits. Wrapping herself in her heaviest coat, Clara fought her way through knee-deep snow to where the stranger had collapsed about 50 yards from her front door. He was unconscious but breathing, his lips blue with cold and his clothing inadequate for such brutal weather. A cowboy by the look of him, worn leather chaps, practical boots, and a hat that had seen better years. Getting him to the house required more strength than Clara knew she possessed, but desperation made her resourceful. She managed a half-drag, half-carry the unconscious man to her front door, leaving a trail of melting snow across her kitchen floor. In the warm glow of lamplight, Clara got her first clear look at the stranger she'd rescued. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark brown hair and features that might have been handsome under better circumstances. His hands, when she checked for frostbite, were surprisingly soft, lacking the calluses and scars that marked men who work with rope and cattle for a living. His clothes told a confusing story as well. The hat and chaps were authentic enough, well worn from use, but his shirt was made from finer cotton than anything sold in frontier settlements. Most telling of all was the gold pocket watch she found in his vest, an expensive piece that seemed wildly out of place on a traveling cowhand. "Who are you?" Clara whispered as she wrapped the stranger in her best quilt and settled him near the stove. For the next 6 hours, she worked to save his life with the practical skills frontier living had taught her. She warmed his hands and feet gradually to prevent the agony of returning circulation, poured a small amount of hot broth between his lips, and monitored his breathing for signs of pneumonia. The stranger, delirious with cold and exhaustion, mumbled fragments of conversation that revealed little beyond an educated way of speaking that didn't match his rough appearance. "Father, the Denver office, quarterly reports," he muttered during one particularly vivid fever dream. Clara filed away these clues while tending to his immediate needs. Tomorrow, if he survived the night, she could worry about solving the puzzle of his identity. Tonight, her only concern was keeping another human being alive in a world that seemed determined to kill everything it touched. As dawn broke gray and bitter over the snow-covered prairie, the stranger's fever finally broke. Clara, dozing in her father's old chair beside the stove, woke to find intelligent hazel eyes studying her with mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse but steady. "Safe," Clara replied, echoing the same words she'd used to comfort many wounded creatures over the years. "You were caught in the blizzard, nearly froze to death." The stranger tried to sit up, wincing as movement revealed the extent of his ordeal. "I need to, my horse." "If you had a horse, it's either dead or long gone," Clara said with frontier bluntness. "You're lucky to be alive yourself." He absorbed this information with a calmness that surprised her. Most men would have been cursing their luck or demanding immediate action to recover their losses. This stranger simply nodded acceptance of circumstances beyond his control. "I'm grateful," he said simply. "You took a considerable risk bringing me in during that storm." Clara shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Couldn't very well leave you to freeze. What's your name?" Another pause, longer this time. "Tom," he said finally. "Tom Walker." The hesitation was obvious, but Clara had learned not to press strangers about their pasts. Half the people on the frontier were running from something, and the other half had simply decided to reinvent themselves in country too big and empty to care about old mistakes. "Well, Tom Walker," she said, rise and check the breakfast she'd been preparing. "You're welcome to stay until the storm passes and you're strong enough to travel. But I'll expect you to earn your keep if you're here more than a day or two." Tom's smile transformed his weathered features, revealing the handsome man beneath the trail-worn exterior. "Yes, ma'am. I'm handy enough around livestock and machinery. Won't be a burden." As Clara served him hot biscuits and the last of her preserved bacon, she found herself studying this unexpected guest with growing curiosity. Tom Walker carried himself like a man accustomed to authority, despite his humble appearance. His table manners were refined, his conversation intelligent, and his gratitude genuine without being servile. But it was his hands that puzzled her most. Too soft for hard ranch work, too clean for the life of a traveling cowboy. Whatever Tom Walker's real story might be, Clara suspected she was hearing only carefully edited portions of the truth. Still, she'd learned to judge people by their actions rather than their words. If Tom proved helpful and honest during his recovery, she'd ask no uncomfortable questions about his past. The frontier demanded such courtesies from neighbors, even temporary ones. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the Wyoming wilderness, trapping them together in the warm circle of lamplight and forcing an intimacy that might have taken weeks to develop under normal circumstances. Clara found herself oddly grateful for the storm that had brought this mysterious stranger to her door. Loneliness, she realized, had been slowly killing her spirit just as surely as the cold had nearly claimed Tom's life. Perhaps they could save each other in ways that neither yet understood. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, trapping Clara and Tom in a forced intimacy that might have been uncomfortable under different circumstances. Instead, Clara found herself enjoying the company of someone who could discuss books, current events, and ideas beyond the daily struggle for survival that dominated frontier life. Tom proved to be an ideal house guest, helpful without being presumptuous, grateful without being servile. He insisted on splitting firewood despite his recent ordeal, repaired the loose handle on Clara's water pump, and demonstrated an unexpected talent for cooking that made their limited supplies stretch further than she'd thought possible. "You've done this before," Clara observed, watching him prepare a hearty stew from potatoes, preserved venison, and wild onions she'd stored in her root cellar. "Some," Tom admitted, carefully avoiding her eyes. A man learns to fend for himself on the trail. But Clara noticed details that didn't match his story of being a traveling cowhand. His knife work was precise and confident, suggesting formal training rather than campfire improvisation. He seasoned the stew with herbs she hadn't even known she possessed, and his knowledge of food preservation techniques impressed her with its sophistication. Most telling of all was the way he handled her father's books during the long evening hours when conversation lagged. Tom read with obvious pleasure and comprehension, discussing Shakespeare and Dickens with an insight that revealed extensive education. "You're not what you seem," Clara said one evening as they sat by the fire, listening to wind howl around the cabin's walls. Tom looked up from the volume of poetry he'd been reading, his expression carefully neutral. None of us are out here. Isn't that the point of the frontier? The chance to become who we choose to be rather than who we were born to be. Clara studied his face in the flickering firelight, noting the way he deflected personal questions with philosophical observations. Some of us never had the luxury of choosing. We became what circumstances demanded. And what did circumstances demand of you, Clara Whitmore? She was surprised by the directness of his question, and even more surprised by her willingness to answer honestly. Perhaps it was the isolation of the storm, or the strange intimacy of sharing her home with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than her potential usefulness. Strength, she said simply. After my father died and my brothers left, I had to become strong enough to hold this place alone, or lose everything he'd worked to build. Tom set aside his book, giving her his complete attention. That must have been terrifying. It was, Clara admitted, but fear makes you inventive. I learned to do things I never thought possible when the alternative was failure. She told him about the first winter alone, when a late blizzard had trapped half her cattle in a distant pasture. How she'd ridden out in sub-zero temperatures to break ice on the water sources and distribute hay to animals too weak to forage for themselves. How she delivered a difficult calf by herself, losing 3 hours of sleep but saving both mother and baby. The hardest part isn't the physical work, Clara continued. It's the assumption that I'll fail. Every neighbor, every merchant in town, every government official I deal with, they're all waiting for me to admit I can't handle a man's responsibilities. Tom's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, and you've proven them wrong. So far, but it's a fight that never ends. Every season brings new challenges, new ways for everything to go wrong. You could sell the ranch, Tom observed quietly. Move to town. Find work that doesn't require fighting the elements every day. Clara's response came without hesitation. This land is all I have left of my father's dreams. Selling would feel like betraying everything he believed about what we could build out here. Tom nodded with understanding that surprised her. Legacy is a powerful obligation. Sometimes it defines us more than our own ambitions. There was something in his tone that made Clara suspect he spoke from personal experience, but before she could explore the comment further, Tom changed the subject by asking about her cattle operation. His questions revealed extensive knowledge of livestock management, breeding programs, and range rotation techniques that went far beyond what most cowboys would know. When Clara mentioned her struggles with predator control, Tom suggested solutions that were both practical and innovative. You could try selective breeding for size and aggression, he said thoughtfully. Larger cattle are less vulnerable to wolf predation, and certain bloodlines produce animals better adapted to harsh winter conditions. That requires capital I don't have, Clara replied. Good breeding stock costs more than I make in 2 years of beef sales. Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression Clara couldn't read. Sometimes investment comes from unexpected sources, he said finally. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving the world transformed by pristine snow that glittered like diamonds under brilliant sunshine. Tom insisted on helping Clara check her livestock, and she was grateful for his assistance in breaking ice, distributing hay, and accounting for animals that had weathered the blizzard in various shelters around her property. You've lost fewer head than I expected, Tom observed as they completed their rounds. Your preparation made the difference. Clara felt a flush of pride at his approval. Few people understood the complexity of winter livestock management, and fewer still appreciated the skill required to minimize losses during severe weather. That evening, as they shared what Tom insisted would be his farewell dinner, Clara found herself reluctant to see him leave. His company had reminded her how much she missed intelligent conversation, and the simple pleasure of sharing daily tasks with someone who understood their importance. "Where will you go?" she asked as they cleaned the dinner dishes together. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "I have business to attend to. People depending on me to fulfill certain obligations. Family? In a way." Tom's smile was rueful. "Sometimes the people who depend on us aren't the ones we'd choose, but duty is duty." Clara sensed layers of meaning in his words, but respected his privacy too much to pry. Instead, she packed food for his journey and mended a tear in his coat that he'd somehow overlooked. "I can't repay your kindness immediately," Tom said as he prepared to leave the next morning. "But I want you to know that what you've done, it means more than you realize. I won't forget." Clara watched him walk away across the snow-covered prairie, leading the horse she'd lent him for the journey to the nearest town. Something about his departure felt final, in a way that left her unaccountably sad. As she returned to her solitary routine, Clara found the cabin felt larger and emptier than it had before Tom's arrival. She'd grown accustomed to his presence in ways that surprised her. The sound of his voice reading aloud in the evenings, his quiet efficiency in helping with daily chores, the intellectual stimulation of conversations that ranged far beyond mere survival concerns. But life on the frontier demanded forward motion rather than sentimental dwelling on temporary pleasures. Clara threw herself back into the endless work of maintaining her ranch, preparing for spring calving, and proving that she could succeed where others expected her to fail. Still, as winter slowly gave way to the promise of warmer weather, Clara found herself scanning the horizon for travelers, hoping against reason that the mysterious Tom Walker might return to brighten her isolated world once more. Spring arrived late and grudgingly in Wyoming territory, bringing with the endless challenges that Clara had learned to face alone. The snow melted slowly, revealing winter's toll on her property. Fence posts rotted by freezing and thawing, roof damage from ice dams, and the heartbreaking discovery of 3 cattle that hadn't survived despite her careful preparations. Clara marked each loss in her father's old ledger, calculating the impact on her already precarious finances. Every dead animal represented money she couldn't afford to lose, but dwelling on misfortune was a luxury that frontier life didn't permit. Instead, she focused on the cattle that had survived, planning for the spring calving season that would determine her success or failure for the entire year. The work was backbreaking and relentless. Clara spent dawn-to-dusk hours repairing winter damage, checking pregnant cows for signs of distress, and preparing the sheltered areas where nervous first-time mothers would need assistance with difficult births. Her hands, already rough from years of ranch work, became raw and bleeding from handling wire, hammer, and rope without the help she desperately needed but couldn't afford to hire. Tom Walker's brief presence during the blizzard had reminded Clara how much easier every task became with competent assistance. She found herself missing not just his help, but the companionship that had made even difficult work feel manageable. Conversations with herself and her animals provided poor substitute for the intellectual stimulation he'd offered during those storm-bound days. "You're getting soft," Clara scolded herself one evening as she soaked her battered hands in warm salt water. Father managed this place alone for 2 years before Jake and Samuel were old enough to help. You can do the same. But her father had been a grown man with years of experience and the respect that frontier society automatically granted to male homesteaders. Clara faced not only the physical challenges of ranch management, but the constant skepticism of neighbors, merchants, and officials who viewed her independence as an amusing novelty that would soon end in predictable failure. The spring calving season tested Clara's endurance to its limits. She delivered 12 healthy calves and lost 2 mothers to complications that might have been prevented with additional help. Each successful birth felt like a personal victory, while every loss seemed to confirm her critics' predictions about women attempting men's work. Jeremiah Hawkins, who owned the neighboring spread, made a point of visiting Clara's ranch during the worst of calving season. He found her in the barn at 2 a.m, assisting with a difficult delivery that had been going on for hours. "This is no work for a lady," Hawkins observed, watching Clara's blood-stained efforts to save both mother and calf. "You're killing yourself trying to prove something that can't be proven." Clara didn't look up from her work, using ropes and careful positioning to help the struggling cow complete delivery. "What I'm proving," she said through gritted teeth, "is that competence doesn't depend on gender. Competence, maybe, but wisdom does." Hawkins's tone carried the condescending patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a stubborn child. "I've made you a fair offer for this land, Clara. More than fair, considering its condition." The calf finally emerged, alive but weak, requiring immediate attention to ensure its survival. Clara cleaned its airways and stimulated breathing, while the exhausted mother struggled to her feet. Only when both animals appeared stable did she turn to face her neighbor. "And I've told you repeatedly that the land isn't for sale, Mr. Hawkins. Nothing about that has changed." Hawkins gestured around the humble barn with its leaking roof and makeshift repairs. Look at this place, Clara. Look at yourself. You're working like a common laborer, ruining your health and your reputation for what? A piece of ground that barely supports 30 head of cattle. It supports them well enough, Clara replied, though she knew her operation was marginal at best. And it's mine. For now. But winter's coming again, and the next one might be worse than the last. How many seasons can you survive losing cattle to weather and predators? How long before the bank decides your loan payments aren't worth the risk? Clara's stomach clenched at the mention of her financial obligations. The mortgage payments were indeed becoming difficult to manage, especially after losing cattle to various causes throughout the year. But admitting weakness to Hawkins would be like inviting wolves into her henhouse. "I'll manage," she said firmly. Hawkins shook his head with theatrical sadness. "I hope you will, Clara, but when you're ready to be sensible, my offer stands. I'll even throw in transportation costs to Denver, where you could find suitable work for a woman of your capabilities." After he left, Clara sat in the hay beside the newborn calf and allowed herself 5 minutes of despair. Hawkins was right about the challenges she faced, though she'd never given the satisfaction of admitting it. The ranch was barely profitable in good years, and a single bad season could force her into bankruptcy. But selling to Hawkins would mean watching him incorporate her father's land into his much larger operation, erasing every trace of the dreams that had brought the Whitmore family to Wyoming territory. The thought of her father's grave overlooking pastures that belonged to someone else made Clara's throat tight with unshed tears. "We'll make it work," she whispered to the sleeping calf. "Somehow we'll find a way." Summer brought different challenges, but no respite from the endless demands of ranch management. Clara spent long days moving cattle to different pastures, maintaining water sources, and fighting the constant battle against predators that viewed her livestock as convenient meals. She became an expert marksman out of necessity, defending her animals against wolves, coyotes, and the occasional mountain lion that wandered down from the high country. The Winchester rifle her father had left her became as familiar as any farm tool, and Clara's accuracy would have earned grudging respect from neighbors who'd initially dismissed her as a temporary curiosity. The isolation wore on her more than she cared to admit. Days passed without human conversation beyond the brief exchanges necessary for business in town. Clara found herself talking to her animals more frequently, conducting long philosophical discussions with her milk cow about the meaning of independence and the price of stubborn pride. Clara was mending fence in her south pasture when she first spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. After 18 months of solitary ranch management, she developed keen awareness of anything unusual in her environment. Travelers, whether changes or the movement of animals that might threaten her livestock. This dust cloud was different from the typical signs of riders or freight wagons. It stretched too wide and moved too steadily to be anything other than a large group traveling together with considerable equipment. Clara shaded her eyes against the September sun, trying to count the individual vehicles creating such an impressive disturbance. Her heart rate quickened as the procession drew closer, revealing a sight that defied explanation. 6 freight wagons, 2 passenger carriages, and at least 20 mounted riders were approaching her modest ranch house with the organization and purpose of a military expedition. Clara's first instinct was fear. Such a large group could overwhelm her defenses easily if they meant harm. But as the lead riders came within clear sight, she recognized the figure at their head and felt her knees go weak with shock. Tom Walker sat his horse with the confidence of someone born to command, his appearance transformed by expensive clothes, fine equipment, and the unmistakable bearing of wealth and authority. Gone was the trail-worn cowboy she'd rescued from the blizzard. In his place rode a man who clearly owned rather than worked for others. "Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore," Tom called out as he approached, touching his hat brim with a gesture that mixed respect with barely contained amusement. "I told you I wouldn't forget your kindness." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the humble drifter she'd nursed back to health with this obviously prosperous stranger. "Tom? What? Who are you?" Tom dismounted and approached her with the same easy confidence she remembered, though everything else about him had changed. His clothes were tailored and expensive, his horse was a magnificent thoroughbred, and the men following him showed the discipline of well-paid employees rather than casual traveling companions. Thomas Caldwell, he said with a slight bow that managed to be formal without being mocking. Owner of the Caldwell Cattle Company, with operations in Colorado, Montana, and soon-to-be Wyoming territory. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Thomas Caldwell was legendary throughout the cattle industry, a young millionaire who'd built an empire through innovative breeding programs, strategic land acquisition, and business methods that had revolutionized frontier ranching. Every stockman from Texas to Canada knew stories about Caldwell's success. "You lied to me," Clara said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I gave you a different name," Tom corrected gently. "Everything else I told you was true. I was lost in that blizzard. I was grateful for your help, and I meant every word about repaying your kindness." Clara looked past him with a small army of workers, the wagons loaded with equipment and supplies, the obvious wealth and power he commanded. This is repayment? Some kind of grand gesture to assuage your conscience. Tom's expression grew serious. "This is an investment opportunity. Clara, one that could transform your operation into the most successful ranch in Wyoming territory. I don't want your charity." "It's not charity," Tom replied firmly. "It's business. You have something I need, prime grazing land in an area where I want to expand operations. I have resources you need, capital expertise, and access to markets that could make your beef operation incredibly profitable." Clara gestured toward her modest ranch buildings, acutely aware of how shabby they must appear to someone of Caldwell's obvious wealth. "What could I possibly have that you can't buy somewhere else?" "This." Tom swept his arm toward the rolling pastures that stretched to the horizon. 12,000 acres of prime rangeland with natural water sources, protected valleys for winter shelter, and grazing that could support 5 times your current herd size. He pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebags and extracted several documents covered with charts, surveys, and financial projections. "I've had my land agents studying this area for months. Clara, your ranch sits in the exact center of the best cattle country in Wyoming territory. But more than that, you've proven it can be managed successfully by someone who understands the land." Clara stared at the papers without really seeing them, overwhelmed by the implications of what Tom was proposing. "You want to buy my ranch." "I want to partner with you," Tom corrected. "Caldwell Cattle Company provides the capital, equipment, and breeding stock needed to maximize your land's potential. You retain ownership and operational control, while we share the profits from increased production. And what happens when you decide I'm not managing things to your satisfaction?" Tom's smile was gentle but determined. "That won't happen, because I've seen how you work. The way you saved my life during that blizzard, the care you take with your animals, the improvements you've made with minimal resources. You're exactly the kind of partner I've been looking for." Clara looked again at the wagons and workers waiting for Tom's instructions. "What's in the wagons?" "Building materials for new barn construction, fencing supplies, equipment for well drilling, and breeding stock that will improve your herd quality significantly." Tom's enthusiasm was obvious as he outlined his plans. "We'll also build proper housing for the workers I'm providing. Experienced ranch hands who know cattle and horses better than anyone west of Mississippi." The scope of what he was offering made Clara dizzy. Everything she'd struggled to accomplish alone, he could provide with resources that seemed unlimited. New buildings, better equipment, skilled help, and access to breeding programs that would transform her marginal operation into something genuinely profitable. But accepting Tom's offer meant acknowledging that she couldn't succeed on her own, despite 18 months of proving otherwise. It meant admitting that sometimes independence required accepting help from others, even when that help came with complications she couldn't fully understand. "Why me?" Clara asked finally. "You could buy land anywhere, partner with anyone. Why come back here?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her work-stained clothes and sun-weathered appearance. "Because when I was lost and dying, you didn't ask my name or demand references before helping me. You saw someone who needed assistance and provided it without counting the cost." He gestured toward the waiting workers and equipment. "I've met a lot of people in business. Clara, most of them see every interaction as a transaction, every relationship as leverage for personal gain. But you helped a stranger because it was the right thing to do, not because you expected anything in return. And now you're back to collect on that moral debt? I'm back because I learned something important during those days in your cabin. Tom said seriously. I learned that success without honor is just expensive emptiness. You showed me what integrity looks like when it costs more than it profits. Clara stared at him, seeing both the humble drifter she'd rescued and the powerful businessman who commanded such obvious respect from his employees. The contradiction still confused her, but she was beginning to understand that Tom Caldwell might be genuinely offering partnership rather than charity disguised as business opportunity. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Tom nodded understanding. Of course, but while you're deciding, would you mind if my men set up camp nearby? We've been traveling for 6 days, and both horses and riders could use rest. Clara looked at the dust-covered workers who'd been sitting patiently while she and Tom negotiated the future. Basic frontier hospitality demanded that she offer whatever assistance she could to travelers, regardless of the complications their presence might create. There's good water and grazing in the meadow past those cottonwoods, she said, pointing toward a natural camping area. Help yourself to whatever you need. As Tom's small army efficiently established camp, Clara retreated to her cabin to process the overwhelming developments of the afternoon. Through her kitchen window, she watched skilled workers handle equipment and animals with obvious expertise, noting the quality of their gear and the respect they showed for Tom's authority. Whatever else Thomas Caldwell might be, he commanded loyalty from people who clearly knew their business. That spoke well for his character, even if it didn't resolve Clara's internal conflict about accepting help that felt too generous to be entirely honest. The mysterious drifter she'd rescued from a blizzard had returned as promised, bringing with him opportunities that could secure her future or destroy her independence forever. Now she had to decide which risk was worth taking. Clara spent a sleepless night wrestling with the decision that would determine her future. Through her bedroom window, she could see the campfires of Tom's crew, hear the quiet conversations of men who worked for someone they obviously respected. The normalcy of their presence gradually eased her initial suspicion, replacing it with curiosity about the partnership Tom had proposed. At dawn, she found him sitting by the creek that ran through her property, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the eastern horizon in shades of gold and rose. He'd traded his expensive traveling clothes for practical work gear, and for a moment Clara could almost imagine he was the simple cowboy she believed him to be during the blizzard. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, settling onto a fallen log beside him. Tom smiled ruefully. "Business partnerships make me nervous. Too many variables, too many ways for good intentions to go wrong. Is that what this is? Good intentions, among other things." Tom's expression grew serious as he studied her face. "Clara, I want you to understand something important. This offer isn't about charity or guilt or even just business opportunity. It's about building something that neither of us could create alone." Clara sipped her coffee, noting how the morning light revealed the care and exhaustion in Tom's features. Whatever drove his success in the cattle industry, it clearly demanded more of him than money could compensate. "Tell me about your business," she said. "The real story, not the public version." Tom was quiet for a long moment, organizing thoughts he'd apparently never shared with anyone. "My grandfather started with a small ranch in Colorado, built it into something respectable through 40 years of brutal work. My father inherited that legacy and expanded it, but he also inherited grandfather's belief that success required sacrificing everything else that might matter. He described growing up in a family where affection was measured by quarterly profits, where personal relationships were evaluated for their contribution to business expansion, where worth was determined solely by financial achievement. When my parents died in a railroad accident 3 years ago, I inherited more money and responsibility than any 27-year-old should handle." Tom continued. "I threw myself into expanding the business because that's what everyone expected, what I thought would honor their memory. But it wasn't enough. It was hollow," Tom replied simply. "All that success, all that wealth, and I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. I had employees and business associates and social connections, but no one who saw me as anything more than my bank account." Clara began to understand the desperation that had driven Tom into the wilderness where she'd found him. "So you decided to disappear?" I decided to find out who I was when stripped of everything I'd inherited. I wanted to know if there was anything genuine beneath all the family expectations and business responsibilities. Tom's smile was self-deprecating but genuine. I thought I was being noble and philosophical. What I was actually being was stupid and unprepared for frontier survival. And instead of dying nobly in the wilderness, you got rescued by a farm girl who made you help with chores. Best thing that ever happened to me, Tom said seriously. Those days in your cabin taught me something I'd never learned in boardrooms or business schools. I learned what it felt like to be valued for who I was rather than what I owned. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication of his words. Tom, I know this is complicated, he said quickly. I know my deception makes it difficult to trust anything I say now. But every conversation we had, every moment we shared, that was real, Clara, more real than anything I'd experienced in years. Clara studied his face, seeing vulnerability beneath the confidence that wealth and success had given him. The Tom Caldwell who commanded business empires might be intimidating, but the man who'd helped her with household chores and read poetry by firelight was someone she'd trust with her heart. What are you really proposing? She asked. Tom pulled out the legal documents he'd shown her the previous day, spreading them on the ground between them. Equal partnership in a new venture. Caldwell Whitmore Cattle Company, with operational decisions made jointly and profits shared equally. Clara examined the contracts with growing amazement. Everything Tom had promised was detailed in legal language that protected her interests as thoroughly as his own. Land ownership remained in her name. Management decisions required mutual agreement. And the profit-sharing arrangement was more generous than she dared hope. This gives me equal authority, she observed. Equal authority, equal responsibility, equal rewards. Tom confirmed. I provide capital and industry connections. You provide land and operational expertise. Neither of us can succeed without the other. And if we disagree about major decisions, Tom's grin was boyish and charming. Then we'll argue until one of us convinces the other, or we'll compromise like any other business partners. Though I should warn you, I can be remarkably stubborn when I think I'm right. Clara laughed despite her nervousness. I've been running this ranch alone for 18 months, Tom. I think I can hold my own in a partnership argument. Over the following hours, Tom's crew demonstrated the scope of improvements they could make to Clara's operation. Skilled carpenters began framing a new barn that would protect twice as many animals as her current structure. Well drilling equipment started creating new water sources that would support expanded grazing. Fence crews strung wire that would allow better rotation of pastures. Most impressive of all was the breeding stock Tom had brought, Hereford bulls and carefully selected cows that would improve her herd's quality dramatically. The animals were magnificent specimens that represented years of selective breeding and probably cost more than Clara's entire current operation. This is overwhelming, Clara admitted as they watched workers transform her modest ranch into something that looked genuinely prosperous. Change usually is, Tom replied. But look at what you've accomplished already, Clara. You've taken raw frontier land and turned it into a working ranch through sheer determination and skill. Now imagine what you could do with adequate resources and skilled help. That evening, as Tom's crew shared a meal around their campfire, Clara found herself studying the easy camaraderie between the men. They treated Tom with respect rather than civility, and their conversations revealed genuine affection for their employer that went beyond mere professional obligation. They seemed to like working for you, Clara observed. I try to treat people the way I'd want to be treated, Tom replied. Pay fair wages, provide good working conditions, and respect their expertise. Most of these men have been with me for years. And what will they think about working for a woman? Tom's expression grew serious. They'll think what I tell them to think, that you're their employer and partner, deserving of the same respect they show me. Anyone who can't accept that arrangement can find work elsewhere. The simple declaration warmed Clara more than elaborate reassurances could have. Tom was offering partnership in every sense of the word, including the authority to command respect from people who worked for them. I accept your proposal, Clara said quietly. Tom's smile was brilliant in the firelight. Partners? Partners, Clara agreed, accepting his handshake with a mixture of excitement and terror. As they worked together over the following weeks to implement Tom's expansion plans, Clara discovered that successful partnership required constant communication and mutual respect. They disagreed about grazing schedules, debated breeding strategies, and argued good-naturedly about construction priorities. But they also complemented each other's strengths in ways that made their combined efforts more effective than either could have achieved alone. Tom's business experience guided their marketing strategies, while Clara's intimate knowledge of local conditions shaped their operational decisions. Most importantly, Clara found herself falling in love with the man she'd rescued from the blizzard. Not the wealthy cattle baron he'd revealed himself to be, but the thoughtful, vulnerable person she'd glimpsed during those storm-bound days in her cabin. No regrets, Tom asked one evening as they surveyed their transformed ranch. Clara looked at the new buildings, the improved pastures, the magnificent cattle that grazed contentedly in the twilight. More than that, she looked at the man who'd kept his promise to repay her kindness in ways she'd never imagined possible. "Only that I waited so long to say yes," she replied, accepting his kiss as the Wyoming sunset painted their shared horizon in shades of gold and promise. Their partnership had become something deeper than business arrangement, richer than simple romance. They'd found in each other the missing pieces that made their individual strengths complete, building together what neither could have achieved alone on the demanding frontier they both loved. The lonely farm girl and mysterious drifter had created something entirely new, a love story written in cattle brands and fence lines, sealed with handshakes and shared dreams, as enduring as the vast western sky that sheltered their impossible, wonderful life together.